it's Scott here. I've put a video together on a method of setting up your springs in a modern cartridge fork. This is the cartridge out of my Honda with the spring removed, and that's a full travel there, and then that's what you would think is a full extension, but in fact it's not, because inside here is what's called a top-out spring, and there's another 35mm of movement to fully compress that top-out spring. So when you have your suspension fully extended, it's actually compressing that top-out spring. Now, to try to get your head around this, you have to think of this as a device that works both ways. With a modern sports bike and the power they have, when you're accelerating, the weight on the front wheel is, at times is zero, because the wheel will actually come off the ground. So they're designed to be in, say, what I'd call the neutral position. Needs to be past that top-out spring. You don't want any influence from that top-out spring. So what I call the neutral position is when you're riding along, not accelerating and not braking. So you don't want to be interacting with that top-out spring. You'd want to be sort of sitting around about here, so just past where the top-out spring starts. So the percentage of the stroke from about here to here is reserved for braking and for entering a corner and for going around a corner. You're operating in this part here, which means you're just sitting on the main spring, and that spring is supporting the weight of the bike and supporting the weight of you. Now when you start accelerating, obviously this extends, and then it gets to a point here where you're into the top-out spring range, and really this part of the stroke is not designed to be supporting the weight of the bike and you, supporting the front of the bike with you on it, because the bike is trying to pivot around the back wheel. Whereas with this top-out spring, it's actually trying to pull the main spring back in again. So what happens is, that last sort of 35mm becomes very sensitive, because the top-out spring is pulling the main spring down. It becomes very sensitive, and the front wheel will track the bumps, and it will eliminate all that skipping and hopping and jumping and tank slapping, and gives you a very sort of plush feel. So, I've done a fair bit of research into this just recently, because I've had a couple of front end crashes lately where I've turned into the corner and I've just lost edge grip, and down I've gone. And I worked out what the problem was, is I just had far too much preload on the spring. So the top spacer was too long, and even with the preload adjuster wound out to nothing, I still had far too much preload. So I was getting far too much interaction with that top-out spring, and I wasn't sitting in the right spot. I need, your ride height needs to be beyond that top-out spring. So there's your top-out spring. That's the end of it there, and it needs to be just a little bit past it. So you need to be, the sag needs to be sort of in this area here, which is more like 45mm, because you want this thing to work both ways. That bit is supporting the weight of the bike from there to there, but this bit from here to here is really just trying to control the front wheel. It's not holding up the bike at all, really, or very little. It's really just trying to control that front wheel and keep it tracking the bumps. So I set up a couple of friends' bikes with the method that I'm going to show you, and I've had really good feedback. I've set my own up the same way, both the 750 and the 600. set it up this way, believe me, you'll have a front end that feels very plush. You get lots of feel, feels very sure-footed, it's very good under braking, but when you accelerate out of the corners, no tank slapping, no skipping around, no skittery feelings at all. It'll feel really plush and it'll follow the bumps. So I hope you find this video very helpful. I'm going to split it into two parts. So this is part one, and then part two will be loading the data into a spreadsheet that I've created, and that then gives you a reference table you can take to the track with you, and you can see the effect of using the preload adjuster, so you'll know exactly what you've got by moving the preload adjuster. So thanks very much for watching. So you can see how these sports bike cartridges are all very similar. They're all pretty well much the same. The one closest to us is the GSXR 750, and the one behind is from the CBR 600RR, so they're identical, so the same process applies. Now I've got a homemade spring compressor here, so the first thing we're going to do is dismantle this cartridge, take the spring off, take the space. So inside of the spacer here there's two 8mm holes, so these 8mm bolts go into the holes, and then we use a 17mm socket on the top here, and this threaded rod inside here just pulls this down, presses the spring, and make sure you have the preload adjuster wound right off. That should be enough. And then you need to make up a tool like this, so it's just two flat bars with 11mm is the cap, because the rod inside here is 10. So you pull up on the cap and slip this under the nut. It's as easy as that. And then we use a 17mm open ender and a 14mm. So the 14mm goes on the nut on the bottom, and then the 19mm goes on the bottom of the preload adjuster, and we just loosen that like that. And now take the whole cap off with the rod. Then you need a tube. You need to make yourself up a tube with a thread inside it, just the same as the top of the rod there, and you can screw that on and then pull it up and take the fork tool off, and that's it. That's how easy it is. I'm just going to show you how to set up the rebound adjuster to get it in the right position. Now, first thing to do is, generally this is the Honda one, but you'll see there's a little setter punch on the adjuster just there, and there's also one on the preload adjuster just there. So what you want to do is screw this in until the bottom of the slot is approximately flush with the base, or with the top of the blue preload adjuster nut. So that's approximately flush, and I want the two dots to be adjacent to each other. So that's about the right spot there. Wind the nut down towards the bottom of the thread, and then just screw this down until you feel the needle touch the seat. Okay, that's just touching the seat there, so that's on the seat. Now wind the nut up till it hits the bottom, and then with your ink pen just put a a mark on the nut and on the shaft, like that. And try not to move this out. So now I can take this off again. Take that out. Okay, so now we don't want to damage the end of the needle there on the seat, so when we're putting the cartridge back together. So now back this off, so wind it out a few turns. You can feel that if I can pull against that, and there's 35 millimeters of travel before it fully compresses. This is the cartridge out of my GSXR 750, and it's identical to the Honda. In this case, the top out spring is a little bit shorter, so when I fully extend that, it comes out about 28 millimeters, whereas the Honda one was 35, and it feels about the same spring rate. What you want to do is put the spacers on. The spring sits in here. Now put the cap on again. And I've put an ink pen mark on this nut and on the shaft here, so I know where it goes. So we'll just nip this up. Now, the next measurement we're going to do is called the extended set length. So I'm going to grab hold of this and pull as hard as I can to compress that top out spring. Make sure the space is sitting in the right spot. That's 257 millimeters. And then the last measurement we do is we measure the free length of the spring. 269 millimeters. 269 millimeters is the free length. So the way I set these up is I have the preload on the mainspring. I have that preload put on by the reverse spring, or by the top out spring. So what we need to do is we need to adjust the length of this spacer so that at the fully extended set length, so when that's fully extended, I want it to be about 2 millimeters less than the length of that spring. Now this has had way too much preload on it, because I can see straight away there's probably about 10 to 15 mils. The extended set length, I'll just say this again, you want the extended set length to be about 2 millimeters less than the length of the spring. So you just want a very small amount of preload on the spring when this is fully extended. So when you're hard on the gas coming out of the corner and this extends, you don't want the main spring to become loose, but you want it to be pretty well having no influence. So my extended set length is 257, and I want it to be, the free length of the spring is 269, so I want my extended set length to be about 267, and I'm currently at 257. So if I take 10 millimeters off this, that will give me the dimensions I'm looking for. So I've marked 10 millimeters here, which is just on the edge of that ink pen mark. And you can generally get a pretty good circular line if you use an old piece of metal measuring tape. So I'll go around saw here with a fine blade. So when you're adjusting these spacers, obviously if the spacer needs to be shorter, you can always just cut a small piece off like we did with my Honda cartridge. If it's the other way and you need to make it a little bit longer, you can use some reticulation fittings that fit neatly over the end there. So if you needed to make it say 5 mils longer, you could do that. The other thing with spacers is 25 mil reticulation pressure pipe is a good material to use, and that's usually the right outside diameter. It's almost identical. You're looking at around 32 to 33 millimeters, and the actual wall thickness is good. And this stuff is fine. It's resistant to oil and everything, so it's not a problem. You don't really need to have this smaller diameter piece on the end. The spring is quite well contained within inside the inner tube. But if you wanted to, you could make up some sort of a fitting to go into the end here if you wanted to have that. So if you find that it's just a few millimeters shorter than what you need, well then you can make it up with the preload adjuster. So we have to go through the same measuring process again. So I've put the new shortened modified spacer on, and then the top spacer. But we're going to two measurements this time. We're going to do the extended set length again, so that's when we fully extend it. But we're also going to do what's called the set length, and that is when it's just touching the top out spring. 235.5 millimeters, 235.5. So I need to write that down. Do the extended set length again because the accuracy of cutting a spacer is not perfect. So just check that again. It's 270 millimeters. So that's the extended. So the set length and the extended set length. We'll be entering those into a spreadsheet. Now I just have to assemble the cartridge with the spring on it, and then we measure the installed length of the spring, and hopefully it's about 10 millimeters less than the free length, because we're looking for about 10 millimeters of preload. The third measurement we need to take is the installed length of the spring. That is, at the moment it's 259 millimeters. 259 millimeters, and the free length is 269 millimeters, so we've got 10 millimeters of preload on the spring, which is what we were after. But we just need to check the extended preload, and so that's actually coming off the base now, because obviously the cutting accuracy on the spacer is not perfect, but that doesn't matter because we have the preload adjuster to do the fine tuning. So let's do the same process with an Olin's 30mm Rebound track cartridge. These are so much easier to work on. The spacer is down the bottom. Free length is 259mm. The fully extended set length is 263mm. On this cartridge, the top out spring is longer, 40mm. 40mm top out spring, and it feels a bit softer. So if we use the same formula, I want the fully extended set length. So that's from the spacer to the spring seat here. I want that, when I've pulled it out completely, like that, I want it to be about 1 to 2mm less than the free length of the spring. So the free length of the spring is 259, and when I pulled it out I measured 263, so I'm actually 4mm too long. So what I've decided to do here is I'm just going to leave this spacer as it is, because I'm only 4mm short, so I can make it up with the preload adjuster, do the fine tuning there. So now we'll do the next stage, where I want to measure the set length, the relaxed set length. So that's the beginning of the top out spring just there. The relaxed set length is 224mm. 224mm. I need to do the extended set length because I've already measured that, because I'm not changing the spacer. So when I did that it was 263. So remember, this has 0 preload. The installed length of the spring is 250mm. 250mm. So I just wound 4 turns of preload on there, which is 4mm, and now that's about right. It's just touching